So, welcome back to Silmarillion Total War and to another battle replay and to another debut really on the new patch for one of the two new factions, albeit actually both of the new factions are in action today, though we have already seen the Avari once before. This is a somewhat familiar map though, because this is a map I believe I've shown off twice on Silmarillion in the past, but it is a pretty good battle to be honest when it comes to a pitch, because there are plenty of different types of terrain. There's open ground of course, as you would expect, also several raised terrain features, but also plenty of tree cover, which given the nature of the new faction in question, and they are more of an ambush style faction, certainly more hit and run based, it should suit them down to the ground. And we will be going through the red team first and foremost, because that is where we're going to see the new faction in action. And yeah, we're going to be spending a little bit more time on the newer faction. We'll be rattling through the other 7 factions on the field fairly quickly, or at least at a brisker pace than we will be talking about this one, because if you've got arachnophobia or a fear of bugs in general, then I do apologise, because that's pretty much one of the central pillars of the horrors of Nand and Gortheb, and they are of course the new faction. Another evil based faction. I won't call them another orcish faction, because while that is a part of what makes them, they are more of a monsters faction than anything else, even more so really. Even than Angband. Angband do have their share of monsters, but with the horrors of Nand and Gorthab, you really can't avoid using them in the same way that you can, potentially, with Angband. You see here at the front, Melkon is going to be having the honour of playing as the horrors of Nand and Gorthab today. It is also a good versus evil, is worth mentioning, which is a fairly rare thing when it comes to the newer builds on Silmarillion, because a lot of the time people want to test what they want to test, so when a theme falls into place like this, it's all the better for me. Which is going to be rather interesting. So we shall see if good or evil triumphs today. But once again, back to the horrors of Nand and Gorthab and Melkon's army. He's got some Karangwi Goreswarm here at the front, which are a very numerous unit of insects, and they are effectively the chaff of Nand and Gorthab. Now, as a hit and run faction, you have to expect that several of their units are either going to be very small in number, very strong individually but very small, or very, very numerous. And that's the case with the Karangwi Goreswarm. They're also very fragile individually, which is another theme really of the horrors. More numerous units, you'd have to say, but they're kind of an annoying unit to deal with, certainly with regards to their stats, because they've got a lot of bonuses in terms of doing damage to other kinds of units, and because there are so many of them, even if it's against higher end cavalry or even higher end armoured infantry, they're going to be able to do a little bit of chip damage. Now of course, if you leave them to their own devices 1v1, they're going to struggle. Their stats are low in the way that other entry level orcish or evil chaff units are going to be. But don't underestimate them, because they will do a surprising amount of damage, and if they are part of a more overall plan from Nand and Gorthab, if they're being used well, they should combine with other units and make a surprisingly effective individual piece of the army. And of course, there are so many of them that it can be an intimidating sight to see them all scurrying towards you. Just in behind, we have another element of Nand and Gorthab's more fragile elements, and that is their orcish units, the Duso-Manuthan orcs. Here we have the Duso-Manuthan Skull Splitters, which I believe are the axe thrower unit that Nand and Gorthab can call upon. In many ways, Nand and Gorthab and the Avari are kind of similar to one another in the two new factions, in the sense that you have two factions with certainly lighter infantry. They're certainly capable of doing a lot of damage, but they're certainly more hit and run focused as well in comparison to some of the more upfront, up close and personal factions that we've seen in Silmarillion. But yeah, Duso-Manuthan Skull Splitters, throwing axes of course do a tremendous amount of base damage. It will be interesting to see how they get on against the army that's across them, because it is Valinor, so they're going to need units like this honestly, because in a straight up fight Valinor's elite infantry will of course be far superior to stuff like these Duso-Manuthan orcs. Interestingly enough though, we may be seeing the two factions with the highest amount of multiple HP units facing off against one another here, because the horrors with all their monstrous units with multiple HP and Valinor with just their straight up heavy infantry as well. It's going to be quite interesting to see. We also have the Duso-Manuthan Flesh Feasters here. They are the highest tier unit of orcish infantry that the horrors can call upon. They're not multiple HP, but they are a very damaging unit. Those dual axes means that they can really carve through lighter units, so the Alqualonde units across the way do need to be very, very careful. But they will find themselves outpaced in terms of the really high-end quality units on this side of the field, which will not always be the case. There will be times where the Flesh Feasters can go toe-to-toe with the best that the enemy have to offer. Factions like the Green Elves or the Easterlings, where potentially their own bodyguards don't have multiple HP either, but certainly against Valinor they'll find themselves outgunned in terms of quality. Dusomnuthan Predators are the Javelin unit that the Horrors can call on. A very necessary unit in this kind of matchup, I would suggest, because you're going to need to do some kind of damage to the higher end Valar that you're going to be facing off against. Yeah, interesting to see how effective these Predators are going to be against really some of the best units that the game has to offer overall, so it's almost the perfect test for them in many ways, the harshest test of armor piercing capabilities or just elite killing capabilities. Another unit of Flesh Feasters here. I think that's going to be everything with regards to the Dusomnuthan, so pretty much the entirety of them is going to be their ranged units, and then the upper end units as well. There are entry level pure melee combatants as well, but it looks as though they are going to be forsaken on this occasion. Moving further back, we will get into the show-stopping units really of Nand and Gorthab, which are of course going to be the Spiders. Starting off with the Karangwi Bloodgorgers. The Spider Cavalry units are multiple HP, in some cases several HP, but then they are very, very small in number as well, which you could... This leads me to believe that you could look at them almost as like a Cavalry Trolls hybrid, but that comparison only goes so far because Trolls of course can be effective against stuff like pikes or lower damage stuff like spears. It's not necessarily going to be the case when you're talking about cavalry, of course, so you do need to be a little bit careful with that. Maybe a better comparison would be something like the Bjornings over in Third Age Reforged, only with the new patches that Silmarillion have had, they've had a chance to make these more monstrous units a little bit more effective, whereas over in Reforged that will come just a little bit later. Over here we have the Hungering Maw. I can only apologise if this is a problem for those of you with arachnophobia, although I feel as though the spiders don't look so photorealistic that it would be a problem. The Hungering Maw is in many ways a similar thing to what we saw from the Grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth over in the Avari, which we may be seeing on the other side of the field as well, in that it is a single entity. Well, actually no, that's more the Urish Abomination, isn't it? It does have a ranged attack though, the Hungering Maw, and I will be interested to see how that works, but in other areas it is of course a single monstrous entity, which, as we've seen with Sauron, the Grandfather, even to a lesser extent the Balrogs for Angband, we know what that sort of thing can be like in the right hands. Karangwi Hunters are a ranged unit of cavalry. They are still multiple HP, it's worth saying, so even though most of the time bow cavalry like this is more designed to be harassment units, and they tend to fall away pretty quickly if you get them in harm's way, because of having more than one hit point, it could be a pretty difficult task to get rid of these guys from shooting at you. There are only so many of them though, so with only 25 of them, how much damage can they do in a short space of time? Well, with 3 of them, all of a sudden there's 75 of them, so we'll have to wait and see if they can do damage quickly enough to a force as dangerous as the Valar, but it'll be interesting to see all of these spiders in action. Now, we'll go through these armies a little bit more quickly, because these are all factions we're going to have seen before. Certainly Tol and Gaurhoth under the command of Captain Gervais. We've seen them in the game for quite a while at this point. They weren't one of the original factions, but they were in the first wave of updates. The Laugskaraz Zagulaklab are a unit of light wargs, which they're very numerous, and they can do damage in melee to other cavalry, but generally speaking, if you want to go up against the very best of cavalry, you're going to need to back them up with some of the other wargs that Tol and Gaurhoth has to offer. The Gi-Jack Skaraz Chosen, I don't know what that pronunciation I was about to start saying was, but they've been very effective actually they were very effective in the last battle that we saw Tol and Gaurhoth take part in. Very useful unit of heavy spears. Tol and Gaurhoth in much the same way actually as Nand and Gorthab, although maybe slightly less so with Tol and Gaurhoth. They do have more infantry options than they have. But they're certainly not a heavy infantry focused faction, so just the fact that they have the Gi-Jack Skaraz to call upon to be that dependable line is something which not every faction has access to. So Tol and Gaurhoth can play that way if they want. We of course have the Scarahai Blooddrinkers as well, which given the fact that several of the good factions are very high on their armour values and can really take a real beating, having the Scarahai on hand is going to be a useful thing. I believe it's Fingolfin across the way for them, indeed it is. So some of the heavier Fingolfin units, the armour piercing that the Blooddrinkers bring to bear will be very useful, as will the missiles that the Scarahai Trappers can bring to bear. Another useful tool for them. We have the Hishtbukraz Ash Priests, which, again, they are Nafatoons done correctly, in my opinion. It really does depend. Even standard medieval 2, the Nafatoons, in comparison to several other types of units, maybe weren't best for me. But the Ash Priests, relative to the other stuff in this submod, are very, very good, and also they're very damaging in melee. Armour piercing, relentless, 3 hit points. Very dangerous, but also they're so dangerous that it's also the optimal target for enemy archers and stuff to go after, when you're playing against Gaurhoth, a fact which will not be lost on Fingolfin, I'm sure. We have the Mangonel, which on loan from Angband, the Ironshod Legionnaires are manning it. Perhaps a ploy to try and get Fingolfin to march into the fire. We'll see if that will be successful or not. A couple of units of the heavier cavalry as well, the Gijak Skaraz Zagulaklab, which I believe this is the unupgraded variant of them. Looks like they may be going off in support, potentially, of Nand Dungortheb to try and give them even more mobility against a potentially dangerous advance from Valinor. Over here we've got some Gijak Skaraz Wolfguard, the armour-piercing infantry version of the spears we've already seen, so they trade in a little bit of their defensive prowess to have that little bit of extra armour-piercing crush damage. We'll see if it's useful. It should be, given the calibre of opponents that they're up against, as will the armour-piercing from the Blood Drinkers. More trappers. We have some Hishtbuk-Kraz Pyre Wolves, which I believe it's not an exact analogous to the Ash Priest, because they have got effectively the Greek fire projectiles that we've seen several times from the Medieval 2 submods. And this is actually a unit I haven't seen in action before, even if it's been a part of the game for a little while. Or has it? Has it been a part? I think I might be thinking about the Angband footbound variant for that. Either way, it'll be interesting to see what this unit can do. Generally speaking, this kind of projectile in Silmarillion is very effective against more lightly armoured troops. Heavy armour can withstand the fiery projectiles a little bit better, but we'll have to wait and see. Over here we have Stewie playing as the Easterlings. We saw the Easterlings actually be very effective against the Avari in just the last battle. The Despoilers of Dor-Caranthir in particular had their moment in the sun. Will they continue to be an impressive unit in this matchup? I believe they're going to be going up against Gondolin in this part of the battlefield, the Easterlings, so it'll be significantly more difficult for the Falksmen to do damage in the same way this time around with the qualities that Gondolin can bring to the table, but not impossible by any means. Marauders of Himring, so going for some more projectiles, which is a wise course of action, I would suggest, given the amount of projectiles, close range projectiles that the Easterlings can bring to bear. A few golden clad individuals in there as well. Some Ravagers, so some more entry level Falksmen as well. At the front we've got a unit of Croatani Nomads, which as far as horse archers go, this is much more the traditional one in comparison to the Spider Riders that we've seen already, in the sense that they will go down under enemy arrow fire pretty quickly because they're not really armoured at all, and they're certainly not multiple HP. A little bit further back, more Despoilers of Dor-Caranthir. We've got the Fangs of the Faithless, which are pretty much an ever-present for the Easterlings because it's the only foot archer that they can bring. They're pretty good in a skirmish fight at range, but in spite of their rather impressive looks, they're more mid-tier in melee than anything else, so don't expect them to carry the day in melee in the way that you might expect based on their rather regal looks. Over yonder, we have some Croatani Huntsmen. Very nice unit of javelin men, which can be used pretty much freely because of course they're relatively low tier, which I'm always a fan of low tier javelins because it's so difficult to know how to deal with them. You either let them do their damage and let a very cheap unit get away with a lot of value, or you dump your own ammunition into them and then you cannot use it on something which is maybe a little bit more dangerous to you later on. Pillagers of Himring, kind of a similar sort of thing with their projectiles, but yeah, an interesting Easterling army, that kind of unorthodox. There's going to be some hidden units in the trees as well. Bear that in mind, because that's certainly not the entirety of the Eastlings army, based on the amount of money that all that would have cost. And finally, we have Angband under the command of Mevon, a very straightforward faction in the sense that they've got a lot of heavy infantry, a lot of monsters, a lot of up-front strength, the sort of thing which you can bring to bear against factions like Gondolin, even Valinor and the like, and Angband will not wilt in the way that maybe some of the other forces of darkness will. Spearguard of the Iron Crown and Tormentors of the Iron Crown are very similar to the Gijak Skaraz over in Gaurhoth, only they're overall a little bit more impressive, I would say, because that armour that they bring to bear is a really useful thing for these line units to have. Just in behind, we've also got some upgraded Ironshod Halberdiers. We've seen how useful Phalanx units in Silmarillion can be, and these Ironshods are going to be no different, certainly. They're going up against, actually, the one faction on the Forces of Good which is less inclined to take an upfront fight, because it is the Avari over on this side of the field. Spearguard of the Iron Crown could be a blessing or a curse, depending on how well the Avari can employ their hit-and-run tactics. It could be frustrating for Angband. We have the Wretches, which they're obviously the chaff of Angband, very numerous, not very effective in melee, but of course the numbers can be very intimidating. The Troll Guard of Gothmog, is that 2 units of Troll Guard? That would be interesting. Yeah, obviously trolls, we all know how trolls work. Got some Ironshod Ravagers with an armor upgrade, some Ironshod Legionnaires with an upgrade. I guess it is an Ironshod upgrade, really. And at the back, the Bulldogs of Angband, a very, very scary unit of bodyguard line infantry. But that's pretty much it. I mean, that makes sense. Angband, obviously, with a ton of heavy infantry, both of a mid-tier and a higher tier, and then trolls, bodyguard units. Simple, but that's how Angband rolling forth to try and crush their enemies with overwhelming force. Will they be able to against Tundra's Fox, the Avari of Torim Duinath? He's got some Thorncasters. We saw them pretty effective actually in the last battle. The Avari ultimately never really recovered from effectively the loss of these units and some of their other skirmishers at the hands of an ill-fated flank. But even when put under pressure, the Avari didn't crumble in the way that I expected them to, and a big part of that maybe was these tree units that they have available to them. Thorncasters going to have to try and skirmish backwards against Angband in a similar way, but they're going to have to pick their targets given Angband's resilience to such things. The Stonehewers of the Darkling Woods, they'll really struggle against the Iron Crown units with the lack of armor piercing and their own fragilities. Even with the armor upgrades on the opposing faction, though, they should do fairly well against the Iron Shots. At least they'll do better. It's kind of a tough matchup, this one, for the Avari again, in a more traditional sense, but the Avari have all the tools to actually deal with a fairly one-dimensional force like Angband's over here if they use their hit-and-run tactics well, so it's probably going to be a pretty good litmus test for them, really. Thorned Ancients, we saw them. They're more of a defensive variant, really, of the Troll Guard of Gothmog over on the other side, which they're going to need, because ultimately, when it comes down to brass tacks, eventually the Avari are going to have to engage with Angband, or they, or one of their allies potentially, may suffer the consequences. Back over here, we have the Shades of the Guarded Path. They are another bodyguard unit which is single HP, but they're very, very damaging. Not too dissimilar to the Duso Manuthan over on the other side, but with a shield, the fact that they're elves, it's going to mean that individually they're maybe a little bit more dependable, but given the scale of the foe that they're going up against, we shall have to wait and see. And that's all we can see actually from the Avari, so they've presumably got plenty of hidden stuff, as you would expect, given the nature of their faction. Inarius, playing as Gondolin, he's got some Knights of the Golden Flower, a terrifying force of Lance Cavalry, which the Easterlings will probably not be all too thrilled about seeing charging towards them. Potentially they could be used to good effect against Angband's heavy infantry as well, if they choose to. Over here at the front, the Scouts of the Tree, a very effective unit that we've seen before as well. Slingers, very low base damage, but it is armor piercing. They can be surprisingly vicious, and if you leave them be, they're going to rack up a good amount of kills regardless of how heavily armoured the opposing unit is. Just in behind, they're also going to be backed up by units of Spearmen of the Swallow. Just in behind them, we have the Shield Bearers of the Tower, which are a very effective unit of line infantry, as we have seen in the past. Going with the Guardsmen of the Harp, which are a more standardised unit of line infantry for Gondolin, but it does mean that you're spending a little bit less, and ultimately, when you're talking about a high quality faction like Gondolin, even their more rank and file units are still going to be quite impressive, especially when you consider they're going to be facing off against an Eastling army that seems to have foregone quite a lot of their Lothland units unless they're hidden in the tree line just in behind. Retainers of the King are another unit of very impressive line infantry as well. Are we going to see some other units? We are. Another unit of line infantry. Gallants of the White Wing, pretty much the entirety of their sword and board units. In fact, I think we will see the entirety of their shielded retinue, because we've got these more Spearmen of the Swallow, another unit of Knights of the Golden Flower. That's a big investment of 2 units of those cavalry units there. Gallants of the White Wing, and again, Armourers of the Hammer. Armour piercing, very, very scary potentially, especially against stuff like the Gijak Skaraz in this part of the field, which is perhaps why they're going to try and contest that hill with Tolin Gaurhoth. Now moving on, we have Fingolfin, played by Farkin. He has got some Fyrdsmen or Fyrdsmen. Don't know, Fyrdsmen or Fyrdsmen? I should know that, given that it's a Saxon terminology, although as I've learned, I actually have more Celtic in my blood than Anglo-Saxon. But yeah, the Fyrdsmen of Dorloman, very dependable, but very basic spear. Over here we have the 2 bodyguard units, the Iremo Arantar and Sons of Hurin, obviously aggressive, defensive. Pretty much all you need to know about those 2 units. Exemplars of their craft, both. Unit of Sentries of Hithlam there. Got some Bladesmen of Barad Ithel, some Marines of Vinyamar for some javelin support in behind, going to be moving with those Gondolin units. On the front line there are some Marksmen of Barad Ithel that are hidden in the tree line. Just in here we have some Fyrdsmen of Dor Loman and some Sentries of Hithlam as well. The Sentries, of course, have got that little red mark to denote them from their spear-wielding brethren. Get my words out properly. Armatara Baraditha are going to give that morale support to the Edine in front of them very nicely, and interestingly enough 2 units of artillery, so the ballista and the catapult should be enough to shut down that mangonel that Gaurhoth had decided to bring. I'd imagine that will be the job of the ballista, and then the catapult can bombard the army, which will put Captain Gervais into a bit of an awkward situation. He'll probably have to take cover behind the terrain, if anything, or maybe choose to fully commit to supporting his ally. And finally, Alexander 10Q, the player who sent me this battle replay, big thank you to him, is going to be playing as the Blessed Realm of Valinor. Got some Swan Guard of Alcolonde. The Alcolonde units, of course, the only one that aren't going to cost you an arm and a leg as Valinor. Speaking of which, the Sentinels of Tyrion, terrifying unit of heavy swordsmen, as of course are the Kinsmen of Ingwe, one of the actual bodyguard units of Valinor, which to be classified as a bodyguard for Valinor, you really do need to go above and beyond in terms of the qualities that you're offering on the field. The Grieving Sons are the highest tier of Teleri that you can bring as Valinor, unit of heavy swordsmen. Lighter heavy swordsmen than the other ones that you can bring, but still very high in terms of quality. Swan Guard of Alcolonde are going to be backing them up, so plenty of Alcolonde units again, which is, when you're on an open field like this, it perhaps does behoove you to invest quite heavily into the Teleri, because it allows you to cover the terrain a little bit more completely. If you go too heavily into the quality, your army is going to be far too small and it's going to get swallowed whole, and especially against a faction I should say, with high mass units like Nand and Gortheb, you don't want to get bullied around the field and get exposed like that. Mariners of Alcolonde will give you a good anti-monster unit, which is always going to be a consideration against them with their big spiders. Another unit that can maybe chip in that regard are going to be the Shoal Hunters, which are the Valinor version of the Slingers, much like the Scouts of the Tree we saw earlier. Sentries of Alcolonde give you that ranged presence as well, a couple of units, in fact 3 units, which they've already put down some stakes. Looks like they're going to try and be a little bit more defensive, maybe take things a little slower. If you march unthinkingly into Nand Dungortheb, after all, that's exactly what they want from you, being that they are that guerrilla warfare hit and run style faction as well, although with their monsters they maybe have a more obvious central pillar than a faction like the Avari, who have actually foregone bringing the grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth, I think, unless this is him back here. Nope, their general's in the Shades of the Guarded Path. But yes, I'm not sure where we're going to be starting, so I will phase into the battle in the normal fashion, because I don't know who's going to engage first and foremost. It may be an artillery duel, we shall have to wait and see, but without further ado, let's begin. So I would imagine that we're going to see the start of the battle over here, and indeed the ballista is firing, as is the catapult. Now it would be interesting to see if the mangonel over on the other side also decides that is what it wants to do. Also going to keep an eye on the minimap, because I do believe Angband are going to be incredibly aggressive. They don't really have too much of a choice, so they may be playing slightly into the hands. And here come the raining fire of the mangonel, actually managing to burn one of the ballistae and actually grilling a section of the Fingolfin lines. Interestingly enough, actually missing all of their shots, which is perhaps something to do with the fact that they're using flaming shot on the ballista, which is a little bit of a mistake, because it does make it a little bit less accurate, a little bit less likely perhaps that you're going to see some of those artillery pieces crumble. You can see now the catapult coming in. Maybe we'll get a shot. It's a little bit interesting that they're going with the catapult after the mangonel as well, but something else to bear in mind as well is going to be the advance of the horrors of Nand and Gorthab into the Valinor lines pretty quickly. The Karangui Gore Swarm are going to descend upon the Swan Guard of Alcolonde. Now this is a fight that the Swan Guard should win fairly comfortably. There are a lot of these insects, but individually they're not going to be enough to bypass the higher quality of the Elven Spears as the battle begins. Are they beetles? Something along those lines. There's also the Grieving Sons in here, which will definitely provide the kind of damage that will be problematic. You can see some of the Gore Swarm taking hits there, Mariners of Alcolonde, but in behind, this is where all of the Duso Manuthan skirmishers can come into full effect and start using their throwing projectiles, which against the Alcolonde units in particular with these throwing axes could be very, very useful indeed. Meanwhile, here in the middle, the House of Fingolfin has moved forward very, very quickly and has secured the high ground. Gaurhoth were right here. They elected not to come up the hill, perhaps because they were microing other things, but this does mean that Fingolfin now does have the advantage in terms of terrain here. Then the Easterlings could assist in a potential push uphill, or artillery streaking over the hills in the distance there. But also, you can see the Hroatani Huntsman pursuing the Knights of the Golden Flower. A quick, cheeky charge into the Ravagers of Himre. Ooh. And could that be That is probably the fire-spitting unit from Gaurhoth. Yes, indeed, the Hishtbuk-Krau's pyre walls managing to grill, and also some of the collateral damage caused there. I mean, the Furtsmen won't do too well against these kind of fiery projectiles, especially when they're on their own. They may very well end up routing, in fact. Meanwhile, over here, this is definitely a very chaotic fight, which is why we're probably going to be at half speed for a little while yet. Stonehewers of the Darkling Woods are going to be colliding with the Spear Guard of the Iron Crown. You can see, even though the engagement is not really the kind of shape that the Spear Guard would like, they're still doing very well because they're a much more durable unit than the Avari, and the Avari don't have the sheer damage to crack through that armour without some assistance. Meanwhile, the Thorncasters in behind are going after the right targets. I mean, the Iron-shod Halberdiers do represent a real problem for the Avari. They're not really going to do too well in a straight-up fight anyway, but they're doomed if they allow a phalanx unit like this to get into position against them. Meanwhile, there's more Thorncasters over here. I mean, it's a very broken-up fight, this, which is perhaps to be expected. Angband are just lurching forward as quickly as they possibly can to try and engage on as many fronts as possible. The Avari are going to have a lot to micro if they're going to be able to deal with this kind of heavy Angband assault. More Spear Guard moving forward, though, some Iron-shod Legionnaires in there. Meanwhile, out on the flank, this is actually the general, I believe, of the Avari, and is this him? Yeah, I mean, this is a little bit unfortunate perhaps for the Avari in the sense that their general model has isolated himself an awful lot by the looks of things. But yes, the Iron-shod Legionaries, I would actually not back the Iron-shods to beat the Shades of the Guarded Path in a one-on-one fight, but based on the shape of the engagement and then also potential reinforcements on the way as well, I don't think the Shades are going to win without reinforcements, which is a little bit of a problem here for the Avari. They're going to need either some reinforcements or a little bit more on the skirmish side of things. They do actually have the grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth, so he must have been hidden in the trees somewhere, which is understandable. Taking an awful lot of damage, however, from the Croatani Nomads, and a close-range shot into the Spear Guard. I mean, sending a lot of them flying, following it up as well with another volley from the Thorncasters. So a lot of punishment that Angband are going to have to take here, but if any faction can take it, it is going to be them. Knights of the Golden Flower trying to help defend the Avari's flank as the Easterlings start to pressurise it as well with some Himring units. The Falksmen will be much better served going after them, I suppose, than trying to deal with Gondolin. It's not as if the Easterlings have too much in the way of infantry, as we saw earlier on anyway. You can see the poison arrows of the Fangs streaking overhead. Will the throwing axes get a point-blank shot off into the Guardsmen off the Harp? They will. That's something, I suppose, but even so, they're not likely to really win a fight like that. Meanwhile, over here, you can see the Karangwi Gore Swarm, several of their husks poking out of the ground in a rather grotesque fashion. Meanwhile, Knights of Tyrion over on the flank, the Duso Manuthan Skull Splitters are in here, one of the better units in melee. They may very well actually, no, that's the Flesh Renders, isn't it? The Predators are there, so yeah, the Skull Splitters aren't going to win that particular fight. Also, Sentinels of Tyrion are going to be really, really dominant against Duso Manuthan units in melee. Where are the Spiders? Where have they gone to? Ah, here we are. One of the units of Spiders, anyway, the Karangwi Bloodgorgers. That is the melee variant, who don't seem to have seen too much in the way of combat so far. These Duso Manuthan Predators still doing their thing. Here is the Hungering Moor in the background, doing its thing, scurrying around with some of the Karangwi Hunts in the background. Hungering Moor doesn't really want to be in sustained melee with something like the Sentinels of Tyrion for too long, but it is obviously one of those single unit entity models that you can use to bulldoze through lines potentially. And there are also some Swan Guard of Alqualonde chasing down more of the Spiders. I think the problem that the horrors of Nand Dungoortheb are going to run into here is being up against a faction with the high quality level that Valinor possess. Their Spiders may very well survive, but the rest of their army almost certainly will not. The Duso Manuthan will probably, well, they wouldn't be enough to defeat the Alqualonde units alone without using all of their ammunition first. When you start to factor into that the Tyrion Swordsmen and stuff like the Kinsmen of Ingwe as well, it's going to be real ugly for them if this continues. You can see all of the beetle husks that are poking out of the ground. Yeah, and it's not looking great for them. But the Duso Manuthan Predators, I mean, they can still do a lot of damage with their javelins, and ultimately if they can knock Valinor down to size and then use their Spiders to maybe assist their allies, perhaps all is not lost. That was actually the Hungering Moor, was it not? Spewing one of its projectiles? I believe it was. What was it firing at? Oh, whatever it was, I missed it, and the Hungering Moor needs to get out of here really. The Karangwi Hunters are going to charge in, pulling out their rather crudely made spears, but Probably enough to do a little bit of damage. They're already bloodied up there, the Sentinels of Tyrion. Anyway, the fight for the hill. They are now trying to push up the hill, Gaurhoth. They and Fingolfin have still been having an artillery duel on regular terrain, but with the superior terrain they possess and also some of the quality units that Fingolfin are going to have in their Barad-Ithel units, it's going to take something pretty significant for Gaurhoth to get up here. I mean, the presence of the Gijak Skaraz means this assault isn't doomed to failure. Bit of assistance from the Despoilers of Dor-Caranth, they're offering some good base damage, which would be good at dealing with the Edain units that Fingolfin possess, but the Javelins are in a really good position. It's not going that way. I mean, the Mangonel is still alive, which could be used to pretty good effect, but yeah, with stuff like the Marines of Vinyamar in a really good position, Fingolfin have definitely got the better end of this engagement, I would suggest. Meanwhile, understandably, I think, it's not going terribly well for the Easterlings in the melee engagement, but then they didn't really invest all that much in their infantry anyway, and they're going up against a faction such as Gondolin. So with other focuses, they could try and kite backwards, but Shield Bearers of the Tower, I mean, if you have a look here, the Knights of the Golden Flower have taken an awful lot of damage, so certainly some good things, but Shield Bearers of the Tower coming in, they need to get those pillagers out of there, otherwise they're going to die off pretty quickly. The remnants of the Easterling line at this point, the Marauders of Himring trying to fight, but again, they're going up against some really good spearmen and some good solid line infantry from a faction like Gondolin, so it's not going to be easy going for them. Croatani Marauders, Croatani Huntsmen charging in. Spearmen of the Swallow, defeat seems certain. I mean, that's something, I suppose. They managed to isolate some archers. There's also some stuff going on in the background. The Easterlings have managed to push a unit of Folksmen and a unit of cavalry all the way back here. Thorncasters are running, and I would suggest that that's... Well, he lasted a lot longer than I thought he was going to. Yeah, as you can see, the infantry that the Avari sent forward was ultimately smashed to splinters by Angband, which is not too surprising, but I do believe the Avari have got some units which are retreating around the back over there, which maybe was always the plan, but yeah, it hasn't gone that well for the Avari over here. Not that surprising though, given the kind of engagement that it was. It's always an arena that you would favour Angband in, and the Avari, while they were able to do a bit of damage with stuff like the Grandfather of the Deep Hearth and their Thorncasters, there's a lot of units to carve your way through as Angband, a lot of solid units as well. So the Easterling flank will now be bolstered by the entirety of the Angband army moving as well. Despoilers of Dor-Caranth are moving. They might all be routing actually. Trollguard of Gothmog, another tough foe for the Avari to deal with. Sons of Ulfang are over here as well actually, which was a unit I missed in the composition phase. A very damaging unit with armour piercing to boot. So while it's going quite well for the forces of good over here, Gondolin and Fingolfin, I think, are going to have to reorganise themselves a little bit. Interesting to see these Laugskaraz have been able to get in behind enemy lines as well. The Ballista is there. They're not going unnoticed though. The Scouts of the Tree are going to head over here, so if Captain Gervais doesn't regain micro on them... No, they're not going to go that way, so I think they're actually going to try and form up a bit of a Helm's Deep, a bit of a final stand here up on this hill. It will give them a really good defensive position, not only against this ongoing assault from Gaurhoth and the Easterlings, which is probably going to fall apart at some stage, but also it will allow them to put on a united front against the other part of the Easterling army and Angband. Now the wild card in this situation, of course, is how are the horrors of Nand DungoRtheb going to get along? Laugskaraz charging in. I mean, I think Fingolfin see that they will need Valinor in tip-top condition to really put them in a good position going forward into the latter stages of this fight. There goes the Hungering Moors projectile again. So it behooves them to send over a little bit of support to try and help deal with this. I think Gaurhoth sees that as well, which is why these Laugskaraz are over here in the first place. But this is a significant amount of reinforcements. Armitar, Sentries of Hithlum, so pikes. Still the Hungering Moor is scurrying around though, doing its thing. Swanguard of Alqualonde going up against the now out of ammunition Duso Manuthan Predators. Whatever happened to the Flesh Feasters? There's a lot of fiery destruction over here. Is that from the Pyre Wolves or is that from the Hungering Moor? No, it has to be from... I don't think the Pyre Wolves are still down here. I mean, you can see the Karangui Hunters are still shooting. Shoal Hunters of Alqualonde trying to do their thing, but you can see the Spiders have actually been a real nightmare to deal with because of their multiple HP nature. And they're still continuing to just fire their projectiles where they can, and these projectiles are going to be pretty good against the lighter Teleri units from Valinor. I think that the problem may still arise when you're dealing with stuff like the Kinsmen or the Tyrian units, but I have to say, while the initial infantry engagements were obviously going pretty well for Valinor, they've struggled to close this out against Nand and Gortheb, which is perhaps the idea behind all of these monstrous units that you can scurry around the field with. Gaurhoth sent over reinforcements as well, so it may actually devolve into two very distinct but very significant fights. Usomanuth and Predators having to fight significantly uphill now into the Fingolfin reinforcements. Evenly matched. I mean, the Predators, I can't imagine they've got enough defensive stats to deal with this many Edain spears. That would just be my feelings on the situation. Hishbukraz Hunters pulling back. I mean, that's a lot of Scarahai units. There's still the Hungering Maw. You can hear its projectile being utilised once again. Sentries of Hithlum charging in, which is something of a unique thing. What on earth was that? Now the Hungering Maw at this point getting surrounded by pikes, grieving sons, and there it goes. Yeah, pikes obviously with a huge anti-cavalry bonus, and it does count as an elephant class unit. So it'll do that spidery thing where it tucks its legs up underneath it as it perishes. That's a bit of a problem, because that was something which could still be used as a really good disrupting tool, even if it was heavily injured. And with all of these reinforcements, Nand and Gorthab, without that pillar to base their army around, they're going to have to rely on their spiders to do their thing. Scarahai trappers moving across, so picking up the baton really over here is going to be this detachment of the Gaurhoth army. They're going to move forward, not arriving in time really. If this had come a little bit sooner for Nand and Gorthab, maybe they could have overwhelmed Valinor, but as it is, I think with the Fingolfin reinforcements being deployed a little bit more aggressively and a little bit more effectively at this point. Meanwhile, Hishbukraz Ash Priest having to deal with yet more deadly projectiles, demolishing the Armatar of Barad-Ithor. Let's go and have a look what's happening over on the other side meanwhile. Angband with not too much of a choice but to charge into this pretty nasty looking defence. Scouts of the tree firing into those units as they approach. Iron shots, I think they're going after the Bulldogs more than anything else, but if they hit something then fair enough. Wait a minute. Oh, I see why the Avari army was so small. He's brought two of these. I'm not sure about the viability of that under normal circumstances, but he's gone for two Grandfathers. Ooh, and those are green projectiles as well from the Arqueni Findicano, armour-piercing horse archers that they are. That is a deadly, deadly unit, especially against monstrous units, interestingly enough. And I guess monstrous infantry is what the Troll Guard of Gothmog are, so if you can cut them down to size, that would be really, really good. The problem is, without any support arrayed against them, the Grandfathers are going to have to pull back if Angband continue to chase them. Marksmen of Barad-Ithor perhaps are going to shoot in. The Armourers of the Hammer are honestly an ideal kind of unit for dealing with Angband, because that armour piercing is so useful against the heavy-duty Iron Crown units. But they're isolated here, and as a result they do end up breaking, and that armour piercing does go both ways when you're talking about the Tormentors of the Iron Crown as well. Meanwhile, the Easterlings pushing uphill into the Scouts of the Tree. I mean, the sheer weight of this assault so far has been super deadly. You need to be a little bit careful with that, because there is a very real chance you could end up routing your own units. With the pressure that the forces of good are under, you do stand a pretty good chance of routing them first, but is that still a risk you want to take? Stuff like the Arimo Arantar and Sons of Hurin need to be getting onto the front line. I mean, yes, they have won over here, but at what cost? They've been pretty adamant about winning that fight, but this is now far and away more of a dangerous situation as the Bladesmen of Barad-Ithor move forward to block an Easterling push. The Retainers of the King outnumbered on the front line with the Shield Bearers of the Tower. In come the Troll Guard of Gothmog as well. So Gondolin, while they had things pretty easy actually in the first half of the fight, now the Easterlings and Angband have come down on their front line like a ton of bricks, and they're really struggling to deal with that. Oof. The Marines of Vinyamar are shaken. I mean, that is a bit of a wild card here, but considering they do have the upper hand in this fight, the Forces of Evil, I suppose firing the Mangonel in isn't the worst thing you could do.
Without their general, they may lose heart and flee.
That would be the Gondolin general. Marksman of Barad-Ithor scurrying up the hill. Still stakes over there. Meanwhile, Karangui Hunters. Hishbukraz Hunters as well. I mean, I have to say, Gaurhoth have arrived. I mean, Nand and Gortheb may be more or less gone at this point, but the damage they've done, and considering how the fight's going on the other side, the Forces of Evil may very well have edge as it stands. Statues of Hithlum. And they've still got the mighty kinsmen of Ingwe in here. Should be able to polish off these Scarahai blood drinkers without too many issues. They've also still got very nasty units of cavalry. Between the mounted and dismounted Tyrian units trying to deal with the Gijak Scaras, and they will do that. So yeah, Gaurhoth will probably lose over here, but I mean it will be at a price for the forces of good, and they will still need to deal with a very dominant looking Angband as the battle goes along. Still a lot of orcs alive over here. Scarahai trappers moving off. Fishbook Krause hunters still going to try and do some damage. There's still the spiders to consider as well. Those poison arrows though could be the sort of thing to send them over the edge, and I mean there's still this many spiders left alive. Such a durable unit thanks to those several HP. Knights of Tyrion. Sentries of Hithlum are routing. Not a good sign for the forces of good, that. Scarahai trappers, so it's a really chaotic fight, this. See the hungering more dead in the background. Flaming arrows being utilised. I'd be really surprised if they were able to rout some of these units from Valinor without a really significant advantage. Meanwhile, the fight for the hill. Scouts of the tree who are wavering, but not dead yet. The grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth being attacked by Trollguard. I don't think they have the numbers here to withstand Angband. I think the decision to bring two of those grandfathers has proven to be certainly the wrong one up to this point, because Angband crushed the Avari infantry, as you would expect under normal circumstances, but the Avari didn't have any of their javelins or such units other than the Thorncasters that could be used to really break up that Angband advance, and they tried to tackle Angband head on a little bit too much, and that really went against them. And as a result, Angband have really had momentum in this fight ever since then, and it's something which the forces of evil have managed to carry so far, but a support coming in from the Easterlings has only increased their strength in this part of the field. Stuff like the Arimo Arantar and Sons of Hurin are still a real problem, of course, Sons of Hurin in particular, for dealing with these more heavily armoured Angband units. One of the Troll Guards still in there. But several parts of this line at this point are looking like they may very well rout. Marksman of Barad-Eithel trying to move backwards so they can continue to shoot, but that's not going to happen. Not when the Troll Guard can continue to chase after you in this manner. Arqueni Findacano moving in, pulling out their two swords, trying to help scour these enemy units from behind this front line which still exists, and to be fair, that's a pretty big rout going on. Is the quality of the Arimo Arantar and Sons of Hurin actually going to be enough to carry the day? With the support of the Findacano offering some charges and some cover, maybe that can be the case. If they can get the Marksman of Barad-Eithel back into a good position. Armourers of the Hammer have returned. More and more over here, it must be said. I mean, the Kinsmen of Ingwe are still standing in some respect, 30 of them. Absolutely monstrously tough to bring down. Over yonder, Gijak Scaras chosen with the Ash Priests. Of course they're going to finish off some disparate Mariners and Sentinels of Tyrion. It may very well be that Gaurhoth actually win over here, and they may now need to, because it's been a very topsy-turvy affair, this. And I don't think there's anything else really going on over that way, so the fight has really started to shrink in size as both sides start to falter. Those Karangwi hunters still alive, still a thorn in the side of Valinor, who at this point probably need to get out of the position that they're currently in. They're going to try and deal with those 18 Scarahai trappers. I'd say those spiders, for a small unit of horse archers, you can definitely see the utility. They just haven't gone away in this fight at all. And as a result, they've been continuously able to shoot in with their arrows, get a few charges off. I was wondering how really tough but small units of horse archers like that work, but I think they have done a good job in this fight, actually. Marksman of Barad-Eithel trying to get into another good position where they can continue to support. The Arqueni Findacano are getting into charge into the rear of these units. The Arimo Arantar is still there. I think, yeah, again, like 29 Sons of Hurin though. the ultimate defense and offense units in many ways. I mean, the Troll Guard might get a few kills, but again, the Sons of Hurin are going to be fairly ideal for dealing with a unit like the Troll Guard. Nightshot Halberdiers are leaving. Still some Spearmen and Swallows, so Gondolin not quite done yet. Supporting their allies with what they have left. Marksman Baradith are going to move this way, perhaps in anticipation of Toll and Gaurhoth with what they have left coming over here to attack. And a few volleys from them on the approach would certainly be a bit worrisome for them, I'm sure. Arantar weathering this storm a little bit better than the Sons of Hurin, as you would expect, but the Sons of Hurin are still going to be very necessary. Fangers of Faithless, like I said, they're not actually as impressive in melee as they may look, but there are still some Bulldogs. How many of them? 13, I believe, was the number? 11 now. There's still some Gallants of the White Wing. So everyone still has some units left, and most of them are actually pretty high quality, but they're also very, very depleted at this juncture as we head into the final 10k frames where it's likely to become a little bit more stretched. Angband's General falls. That could be pretty devastating actually, especially with these rear charges. Yeah, those Spear Guard of the Iron Crown. The bulk of what is making this fight for them continue going is now broken. Real problem for them, so very good use of the Arqueni Findicano. They turned this fight around. For a while it looked like they wouldn't be able to get their ducks in a row in time to stop the relentless Angband march with the Easterling support, but in the end they were, and you have to say a big part of it was because of the quality that Fingolfin was still able to bring to the table. Spearmen of the Swallow, the Spiders coming in to do a little bit of damage, a little nibble before the inevitable main assault, although I have to say I don't know what they necessarily have left to actually assault with, per se. Is this the Kinsman of Ingwe? Yeah, only one left. The Valinor General, killed off finally by the Hishtbukraz Ash Priests. This isn't going to be enough, I don't think, to mount an assault on Fingolfin. The forces of good have the edge at this point. So is the onus on them perhaps to attack the forces of good? Currently looking like they might attempt to sit up on those hills, but with a few volleys yet that they can send into the Karangui Hunters. I think it's probably the onus is on the good team at this point to push forward. They have certainly more strength to them, especially with the Catapult crew coming back, some Armourers of the Hammer 33. I mean, I think regardless of what happens here, I think that the good team are going to win. I don't think that Toll and Gaurhoth have got enough left to withstand what, at this point, primarily Fingolfin. And it is interesting that the two factions that stood off one another earlier in the fight, more so, Fingolfin and Toll and Gaurhoth didn't really engage as quickly as the other engagements on the field happened, and they are really the last two armies left on the field, with a little bit of Nand Dungoortheb and a little bit of Gondolin remaining as well. Look over here, the Spiders continuing to do their thing. I mean, Mangonel, remounting the Mangonel, I mean, it could be that trying to sit up on top of that hill could be disastrous for them, but I think they realise what the threat now is, because the Arqueni Findicano are coming over here to deal with the Mangonel crew, and they should do so unrelentingly. Going to try and get into a position on top of this. I mean, they are Ironshod Legionaries, so they are a unit of line infantry in their own right, so if they do get into a defensive position, the Findicano can't just bump into them and expect to defeat them handily in melee without any sort of reprisal. In come the Karangui Hunters. Spiders going up against one of the finest units of cavalry the game has to offer, certainly one of the most striking looking in the Findicano. And that's going to be the end of the Spiders. They've been very effective so far in the battle, but to be fair, maybe their luck has run out. Spiders with their Duso Manuthan riders. Those Ironshod Legionnaires are going to get seen. Like, they're not going to forget about them, and yeah, like, it's a fool's hope to believe that you're going to be able to mount that Mangonel again, because there's no way that the Findicano should be letting them. Yes, they're going to have to charge uphill, and yes, that's not ideal, but all you need to do is engage them, send some infantry over here, Spearmen and Swallow, Armourers of the Hammer. Yeah, that's the kind of units which are going to eat, and that really, with that goes the evil team's final hope of winning this fight. I think if they manage to mount the mangonel and get some really good hits into those units as they were setting up position on top of that hill, that could have been a way to turn the fight around back into Gaurhoth's favour. But as it is, it's not going to happen now. So the sheer strength they have left should be enough. The Ash Priests alone are not going to be strong enough to withstand all that they have left. And it is mainly Gondolin that are coming over here to try and deal with this pocket of resistance. Times 6 through their ascent up the hill, given that they slow right down when they're going up an incline like that. But Catapult Crew versus Catapult Crew. This one's taken a little bit more damage. I mean, individually, Bladesmen and Baradites are going to be stronger. But with the numbers, they're going to need a little bit of extra help, I think, to bring down these iron shots. Fortunately, the armours of the hammer ideally placed to do so. Quanifin Decano moving forwards. You can see that both sides have got pretty much the same idea. I mean, I would hope that once the Forces of Good have dealt with that Mangonel crew, that they would be willing to attack into Gaurhoth here, because just having a look, Hishbrook Krauss Hunters, even if they have a bit of ammunition, so what? Like, you're going to be able to close the gap before they do any significant damage. Scarahai Trappers, it's the Ash Priests that are the problem in melee, but they don't have any ammunition by the looks of things. The Gijak Scaras chosen in nice defensive shape, there's a fair few of them, but again, Sons of Hurin, Arimo Arantar, Armourers of the Hammer are still going to have some units remaining. Indeed, here they are. I mean, we saw them holding the line all on their lonesome under normal circumstances, so effective against Angband, but so isolated they actually got handily beaten. Such is the way of things. Defeat is a distinct possibility. Wavering. I'm actually surprised they haven't routed already, but the Gallants of the White Wing are still here as well, still 12 of them, so Gondolin having a lot of those. I kind of like the Greek look to elements of what the Armourers of the Hammers model has to it. Still fighting on, this Mangonel crew. Brave orcs? It's more likely than you'd think. I guess the punishment for failure for an Angband orc is probably worse than the death they would suffer at the hands of these elven blades and hammers. Are they starting to move forward now? It looks like they might be. Yeah, Fingolfin are going to move forward, so good on them. And also they have Marksman of Barad, I thought they can use as a supporting tool anyway. So that will be the final stand. Gaurhoth on their hilltop as Fingolfin and a little bit of Gondolin support attempts to dislodge them, which I would back them to do with the strength that they still have left. Defeat is a distinct possibility for the Mangonel crew. Is that so? I never would have guessed. They've actually started to regain their composure a little bit in terms of morale, which is a little bit bizarre. Banner carrier. I have to say as well, the Fingolfin catapult crew actually hasn't taken all that much damage. Meanwhile, Quanifin Decano getting ready to attack into the rear of these units. Looks like they've already tried to charge uphill, to be fair, and the Ash Priests are now blocking this route up. There's still actually the Nand Dungorstheb General on his Blood Gorger. That's something, I suppose. They are going to be able to skirmish with the enemy, try and finish off what remains of these Scarahai trappers up on the high ground. Over here. Now they're wavering. They are dying a lot slower than I would expect, though, considering maybe against the marks of the Bladesmen of Barad, given they're fighting uphill, but the Armourers of the Hammer should be slaughtering these guys, I would have thought, but perhaps not. Perhaps not. over yonder. Spearman of the Swallow, downhill that comes the Bloodgorger General, doing a little bit of damage to the Marines of Vinyamar, who are leading the way. Ooh, and the line actually getting a little bit disorganised there, but now the Gijak Skaraz Chosen will push forward. Ultimately, these Fingolfin infantrymen, I mean, the Marines of Vinyamar aren't going to do very well here. They're going to need some support. That was maybe a little bit premature. Especially with the Ash Priests right there. Gijak Skaraz Chosen going to turn around now with the Arqueni Vindicano charging into the Hunters. The Hunters are going to be needed just for the numbers that they offer the army that is remaining, so this Gijak Skaraz Chosen going to bail out their allies on the field. Here come the Sons of Hurin. I mean, this is obviously going to be a real problem, regardless of the Hunters' route. Immediately as the Sons of Hurin come charging in, and the Gijak Skaraz Chosen will really not like being in melee with humanity's finest. Aruma Arantar moving in here as well, so the Ash Priests will dominate that frontal fight, but little else will be forthcoming. Still, the Ironshod Mangonel crew continues to hold on and fight the good fight. It's over here, which is the more interesting fight now. The Arqueni Vindicano getting in and amongst things. That's a little bit bold, maybe, a little bit overly bold, getting in and amongst all of those rusted orc spears. And Marantar, of course, will do their thing. The Ash Priests represent a bit of a threat. I mean, they are relentless. They're probably not 3 hit points anymore, with several of them significantly bloodied, but potential problem. The Ash Priests will be pretty good against something like the Aruma Arantar. Marksmen of Barad-Ithil that are out of ammunition coming in, supporting the Sons of Hurin. That will definitely be enough to overwhelm the Gijak Skaraz. I think based on the turned unit model, yes, they're routing, so that's the end of that. These units will plod their way over, but I think by the time they get here, the fight will have already resolved itself in favour of the forces of good. I'd say that Sons of Hurin, only 20 of them remain. Gijak Skaraz Chosen dropping like flies, though. Aruma Arantar pushing forward into the scariest unit of infantry Tol Gaurhoth have to offer. And the Ash Priests, there are more of them than the Aruma at this point, so you would back them, honestly. A little bit of support coming in from the Scarahai trappers on that hill. And there goes the Fingolfin General. Small victories. Spearmen of the Swallow firing in as the Marksmen of Barad-Ithil are also there. Finally, the horrors of Nand Dungortheb General has been hunted down by the Vindicano. Yeah, this is going to be nothing other than a last stand for Tol Gaurhoth, but it can be an impressive one. And the Gijak Skaraz gone, destroyed to the last man, and now the Marksmen of Barad-Ithil will charge forward to try and help overwhelm the Hishtbuk-Kras. So those Scarahai up there, I mean, the amount of damage they're going to be doing is ultimately going to be pretty limited. They're going after the Sons of Hurin. Remo on the front line. I mean, they are losing. They're taking a lot of damage. I mean, with all the support they now have, that fight will almost certainly turn back around with all the Barad-Ithil units, the scouts of the tree that are now alongside them as well. The amount of hits that the Ash Priests are going to be taking will simply be too much for them. Still the Spearmen of the Swallow offering a little bit of range support as well. The Scarahai trappers rout as a result, so the unit of Hishtbuk-Kras will be the last. The Sons of Hurin and the Vindicano also going to join in with the festivities. Oof, run through with the Trident. 22 of them remain. I mean, this is where their relentless trait actually does come in handy when they're fighting a fight like this, because it means they can't be stun locked. They will continue to swing those axes and do that damage. Give Captain Gervais a few more kills as we head towards the results screen. Spearmen and Swallow out of ammunition, so they too are going to join in. 30 light spears. Will the other units arrive in time? I highly doubt it. On the other side of those trees. I mean, there's not an awful lot left. If we have a look, I mean, 3%, that seems about right, given the amount of units that are left. Fingolfin with the lion's share of them, Gondolin, but both Valinor and the Avari completely gone. Marksman scouts the tree. I mean, yes, 2 of the units that are still alive are going to be Ivrimo, Arantar, and Sons of Hurin, but it's not only elite units, so the margin of victory is going to be fairly slender here. 4 Ash Priests remain, and we may as well go up to ×2 speed from here, I suppose. There are the Armourers of the Hammer. They could have made it, maybe, if they were sprinting the whole way, but I guess they've earned a little bit of a break. And that is going to be that. Good to see both of the new factions in action today, and I think especially the Horrors of Nand Dungotheb, we got to see what they were all about, because they were up against Valinor, who offer some very clear and very potent strengths, and yet they weren't found wanting. The Forces of Evil actually won over on that flank, really. A big part of that had to do with the spider units as well that they have to offer. There's still one, and it is a banner carrier. What is effectively one of the Goblin band unit models as well. Stood before all of these mighty warriors of yore. The catapult crew over there as well. Yeah, good battle this. Another entertaining one that we get to see here in Silmarillion. And there he goes.
Victory is ours, but only by a sword's edge.
Yeah, and it was very chaotic early on, so it really could have gone either way. But in the end, that strength that was marshalled by Fingolfin was just about enough to see the forces of good over the line. It was looking a little bit hairy there, like I said, the Avari. I really don't think the double Grandfathers build worked out all that well, especially given the amount of upfront strength that Angband have, because even under normal circumstances with the Avari, when you're committing all of your resources towards that sort of thing, I wouldn't back them in a fight there against Angband. So the fact that you're cutting down your strength even further by going into the red limit on a very expensive, very specialised unit, you're going to struggle against Angband, and that momentum could ultimately have been a winner for the Forces of Evil, especially with the support that Stewie's Easterling army was giving, even though the initial waves didn't go so well against Gondolin, but I don't think he really expected them to, given his composition. Later on, however, it could have gone differently, but Fingolfin and Gondolin were able to really build up that defence on top of that hill, consolidate, and that was good. Toll and Gaurhoth, I think, did well as well, but again, with them and Fingolfin, they by default really were marshalling more of their strength for later because of the artillery duel that was going on. He really did help out Melkon, the Horrors of Nand and Gorthab, helping them deal with Valinor, which was good. But in the end, it wasn't quite as comprehensive as how Fingolfin and Gondolin were able to turn back the Angband tide over on the other side, and obviously it was always going to be difficult to recover from there. But it is what it is. Let's see what did the damage for Valinor, who actually got tons of kills, which is not too surprising, given they were going up against both the Horrors and Toll and Gaurhoth forces at some point. So yeah, lots of kills for them. Interestingly enough, by far the biggest army on the field was Angband's, but then they were almost entirely infantry units. And they did have two units of Troll Guard, but other than that, they didn't have skirmishers or cavalry or stuff like the Valor-Aukar, the Balrogs, to cut down on their unit count. So it is not too rare for Angband to do that, actually, and we saw how effective it could be, at least initially, but it does have the problem of fizzling out a little bit over a longer battle. But yeah, Kinsmen of Ingwe, obviously we saw how incredibly tough they are to kill in this battle, and they were able to rack up a decent kill count for themselves while they were still standing. The Grieving Sons did very well, but then they were also on the front line early on against the Karangwi Bloodswarm, which are fairly weak units. Sentinels of Tyrion doing very well, heavy swordsmen, the Alqualonde units. Like I said, the Alqualonde units, they're going to do pretty well against the Swarm, the Karangwi Swarm, and also the Duso Manuthan units when they're in melee. If they're getting nailed by projectiles, though, which probably did happen to a certain extent, but again, Sentries of Alqualonde, Mariners of Alqualonde, again, 308 kills on a unit of Javelins is pretty damn good. Several units getting 300 kills, including the cavalry, actually, the Knights of Tyrion doing very nicely, the melee cav, but that was mostly against infantry units, really, because it wasn't too often we saw them tangling with the spiders, and that's exactly what the Horrors of Nand and Gorthab would have been hoping to avoid anyway, so it's fair play all around, I would say. And yeah, we got to see the Horrors in action today, which I'm glad of, because obviously seeing all the spiders was something that was in Vanilla Third Age, but they were mechanically a real nightmare, kind of similar to the Ents and the like. It was one of those things which at the time was basically made the game unplayable, But it's good to see that we've had the Ents back for a long time, but it's good to see people getting creative with stuff like the spiders as well. And it also gives the game another much needed evil faction, I think. And it makes them distinct, certainly from Gaurhoth and Angband, and obviously the Easterlings as well. But yeah, good to see, certainly. I think all that remains really for Silmarillion, as far as I'm aware, are the Nalgrim, the dwarves, which people have been waiting for a long time, but it's one of those things that when people look forward to it that much, I guess you have to spend a little bit of extra time on it to make sure that you get it right. And also that is intended to be like a full faction that you can play as well in the campaign as well as multiplayer, whereas I believe in the case of Valinor, the Avari and the Horrors of Nand Dungortheb, they're going to be in the campaign, but they're non-playable factions. I believe for Valinor they're intended to be a late game crisis for if you're playing as certainly Angband, but maybe all of the evil factions. And for the Avari and the Horrors of Nand Dungortheb, they're intended to be in the mix for certain factions that otherwise geographically wouldn't really have too much of an enemy. So I know, for example, the Horrors of Nand Dungortheb are intended to be a threat that Doriath have to face. But yes, enough of that. And another good fight in Silmarillion. As for what's going to be coming up next, we are going to be seeing a little bit more in terms of Third Age Reforged, a wintry siege of Dale, which, as we are in December, is going to be, I think, fairly appropriate. There is another Third Age siege as well I have, which I believe is on Tol Falas, which has been quite a while since we've seen Tol Falas, so I don't mind too much showing off that particular map again. And of course we're going to be continuing with a bit of Rise of Mordor stuff as well, in the same vein as the first video that I showed. Again, I'm not entirely happy with how well my PC can show Attila. I mean, it's okay for what I'm doing at the moment, but it wouldn't be the sort of thing I'd want to do for battle replays. We'll have to wait and see again. Like, my intention at some point in 2022 is to get some new hardware anyway, so it's not too much of a problem. But yeah, big thank you to Alexander10Q for sending this replay to me. It's worth saying that he sent me some more as well, so this won't be the only battle that we see from him. Big thank you to all of the players for being a part of this battle replay. Hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.